days after he shot Lincoln, John Wilkes Booth is still on the run. In Caroline County, Virginia, Booth and Davy Harold seek refuge at a tobacco farm owned by Richard Garrett. At 2 in the morning, Union forces get a tip, and soon a search party of federal soldiers deploys around Richard Garrett's Virginia farmhouse. Garrett refuses to give Booth up, but his son points nervously to the tobacco barn 50 yards away. As the barn is surrounded, Davy Harold comes out with his hands up.
But Booth refused to surrender. This was his most heroic role, and he was going to play it to the hilt. And he shouted out, "Well, my brave boys, prepare a stretcher for me."
Conga decides it's time to take action. Within seconds, the barn is ablaze.
At this point, it has become a theater. The stage is lit, the barn's on fire. A lot of folks realized it for what it was, this final performance. It was an incredible display of courage and bravery in the face of certain death.
By the light of the fire, Conga can now see John Wilkes Booth. Sergeant Boston Corbett has fired through the barn slats without orders.
The bullet cuts through his spinal cord and he is paralyzed. They drag him to the front of the house and summon a doctor who judges the wound to be mortal. At 7 a.m., he asks to see his hands. Through purple lips, he mutters, "Useless, useless," and then dies.
And that must be it to the Lincoln assassination, right?
And what many people think about the Lincoln assassination, which is that John Wilkes Booth shot Lincoln and killed him in Ford's Theater.
But Booth's murder of President Abraham Lincoln is only part of the story. The rest is a hastily designed plan involving Southern sympathizers, abandoned kidnappings, wartime trials, and an attempt to decapitate the Union government just days after the end of the Civil War.
On March 17th, Lincoln intends to enjoy a carriage ride on the outskirts of Washington. But John Wilkes Booth and his band of conspirators have other ideas.
And the plan that they originally had was that they were going to kidnap the president. That quickly proved to be unworkable.
They intend to spirit Lincoln down to Richmond and exchange him for Confederate prisoners of war. But at the last minute, Lincoln changes his itinerary and remains in the city. Booth becomes extremely frustrated.
So at that point, Booth's thinking, well, maybe it's assassination. He got close to him at the inaugural, physically close to Lincoln at the inaugural. He thought to himself, could have shot him.
Booth recruited 9 others to help with the assassination.
David Harold, an impressionable and dull-witted pharmacy clerk, led Booth on the escape route into Virginia. He surrendered at the Garrett farm, was tried and convicted, and was executed by hanging in July 1865.
George Azerodt was a carriage painter and boatman who had secretly ferried Confederate spies across southern Maryland waterways during the war. Recruited by Booth in the conspiracy, he was assigned to kill Vice President Andrew Johnson, but lost his nerve and stayed in the hotel bar, drinking instead. Azerodt was executed by hanging in July 1865. Lewis Powell was a former Confederate prisoner of war. Tall and strong, he was recruited to provide the muscle for the kidnapping plot. When the plan failed, Booth assigned Powell to kill Secretary of State William Seward. He entered the Seward home and severely injured Seward, Seward's son, and a bodyguard. Powell was tried and convicted and was executed by hanging in July 1865. Michael O'Laughlin. Booth's childhood friend was an ex-Confederate soldier. After he turned himself into the authorities, he was tried as a conspirator. Though his role remained unclear, O'Laughlin was sentenced to life in prison and sent to Fort Jefferson off of Key West, Florida, where he died of yellow fever in 1867. Mary Surratt. She owned a boarding house in Washington where the conspirators met. The subject of some controversy, she received the death sentence and was put to death by hanging in July 1865, becoming the first woman executed by the United States. Samuel Arnold, another longtime friend of Booth. Arnold was not in Washington at the time of the assassination. However, investigators tied Arnold to Booth's original kidnapping plot. Sentenced to life in prison, Arnold was pardoned by President Andrew Johnson and survived until 1906 when he died of tuberculosis. Samuel Mudd. Prosecutors succeeded in showing that Mudd, a doctor who set Booth's broken leg during the night of April 14th, was well acquainted with Booth before the night of the assassination. He escaped hanging by one vote of the military commission that he had been convened to try the conspirators. Like Arnold, Mudd was sentenced to life in prison but pardoned in 1869. He died of pneumonia in 1883. Edmund Spangler, a stagehand and carpenter at Ford's Theater. Spangler knew Booth well and assisted him on April 14th at the theater. He was not connected to the kidnapping plan, but he was found guilty and sentenced to 6 years in prison. Pardoned by President Andrew Johnson in 1869, Spangler moved to Maryland, where he remained until his death in 1875. John Surratt was Booth's most valuable conspirator. He was a Confederate spy with a college education. Surratt introduced Booth to Harold and Azeroth and conspired with the others to kidnap the president, but was not in Washington several months later when the assassination was carried out. Surratt fled the U.S. when he heard the news of the crime and lived in Europe as a fugitive for several years until he was arrested in Egypt in 1866. Tried by a civilian court in 1867 through 1868, Surratt was not convicted of this crime.
Object of the conspiracy. It was essentially to accomplish what the Confederacy had failed to accomplish on the battlefield, and that was to win the war.
Booth's first plan was to kidnap Lincoln and hold him for ransom in exchange for Confederate POWs. Among those he recruited was John Surratt, Mary Surratt's son. When that plan failed, he and his co-conspirators decided to not only assassinate Lincoln, but also Vice President Andrew Johnson, Secretary of State William Seward, and Union General Ulysses S. Grant.
It was a desperate act, an opportunity seized upon by Booth that Lincoln was going to appear at the theater, and in fact originally he was supposed to be at the theater with Grant.
But Grant's wife and Mrs. Lincoln were not on friendly terms, so the general declined the invitation. Vice President Johnson's would-be assassin, a German carriage maker and Confederate smuggler named George Atzerodt, first got drunk, then got cold feet. He abandoned the plan. Meanwhile, Seward was stabbed multiple times by Lewis Powell, but none of the wounds were life-threatening, and he survived. So while Booth had killed Lincoln, the greater plot had failed.
1865.
After a 7-week trial, Surratt, Atzerodt, Powell, and David Harold, who had escaped into Virginia with Booth, were found guilty and sentenced to death. They were hanged on July 7, 1865.
John Wilkes Booth wasn't the only one who wanted Lincoln dead. The group of conspirators helped execute the plan, yet all did pay the price of murder.